So, hello, Lucy Brazier. Lovely to meet you and lovely to have you on the Therapy Works podcast. You're a ghostwriter and an author. You
Yeah.
work with Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. And maybe start by telling us what is the particular challenge that you are facing or have faced.
Thank you very much for having me here. I really, it's a real honor to be talking to you, Julia. And my husband has struggled with depression for many years, and that has been part of our marriage. And
Like the sort of third unwelcome ghost
Yes.
in the marriage.
Yes, throughout. And it was something that I'd known all along. It wasn't a surprise, but there were periods of time where it was very hard and there were triggers throughout each year. And we got to a point where we had decided to divorce. And
Gosh.
coincidentally and sort of slightly hilariously, it turned out to be National Divorce Day, which is the
January the 6th.
first Monday in January after Christmas, when everyone goes back to work, you know, one of those trigger days like Blue Monday and Black Friday and whatever. And so we decided after over 20 years together that we both felt mutually that we couldn't continue. Me, because I didn't want to live in that environment any longer, and him because he felt not only was he struggling, but he felt the pressure, I think, that I was putting him under to change and be different.
The tone of your voice is almost like you're talking about somebody else, like it feels like a very far away version. And I imagine it was extremely, 20-year marriage. But also you said every year in those 20 years, there were triggers and things that went wrong. So it's been quite a grinding, I mean, I'm sure with highlights and high spots, but it's been quite a grind, the marriage.
Yes, it has. There have been lots of points where I've thought we just can't continue, and all of those emotions of grief, of anger. I don't think I realized how angry I was for a lot of the time.
And that anger that's unexpressed goes into resentment and it sort of contaminates. You see the person with this through this horrible kind of resentful lens, don't you?
Yes. And that, I think, was really hard. And I think that was something that he found really difficult. And
because you weren't loving him as he was, you kept on wanting him to be different from who he was, legitimately. And he could see you were legitimate.
You know, it's such a difficult thing, because it feels like a very selfish thing. It feels like a very selfish thing to say, stop being depressed and be okay,
cheerful,
and be part of our family. And because when he was, and obviously there were long periods of time when he was, it was great. And it just became, those periods of time became quicker to come around. You know, the sort of difficult things were quicker to come around, and they became more difficult. And I think that was also because we've got 3 children and they were getting older. And so when they're young, everything is focused on family and survival,
getting
and
them fed and bathed and school, and
everyone's through the day, and then you get to the weekend and everyone's tired and you just want to have a nice time. And so that was a big chunk of time as well. But then there were periods where Steve was really struggling, and I just didn't have the energy to support him. I didn't have the space to support him. And I think that also changed because the children were getting older and I was working, I've worked full time. And that was again where resentment came in, because I thought, well, where am I in this?
Yeah. I think what's really interesting and also complicated is that there's a sense of he couldn't help being depressed. And so there's a part of I imagine the story you told yourself about your marriage and him was, well, it's not his fault. I have to tolerate it. but it was almost like a pile of poo that was under the rug, that every time you tolerated it again, there was more that you had to kind of overcome and look past. And it got to a point where you were kind of swimming in all the bad stuff, and there wasn't enough of good stuff to keep yourself alive. So as much to keep the relationship alive and keep the connection alive and keep the willingness to fight for the bond, for the good things. So it's almost like you'd run out of steam.
I think we both fought for a long time. And one of the amazing things that I think kept us together was that he tried throughout to find an answer. You know, he
didn't give up.
He did not give up. And I think that's a big reason why we didn't break up before now.
And you could really love him for that.
So hard at trying to solve it. And it really was the point where we felt that we had done everything. He'd had every type of therapy. We'd spent all our savings really on treatment.
Gosh.
And each time we thought this
have this hope, and then it didn't work.
And it didn't work. It was just that
relentless.
Point where it was relentless. And it was at that point that I thought, I really can't stay. I just can't do that anymore. And it feels the sort of terrible, like you're walking away from someone while they're drowning.
Yeah, it feels so against what the version of yourself that you want to be. But and I think a lot of people will recognize this, you know, that sense of, you know, I want to be the wife that loves you in sickness and in health. And I've done it for 20 years, but actually you got to the point where there was nothing within you that you could keep fighting for.
Absolutely. It was that point where I think, and we'd had the conversation before, but not to the extent where we were both, you know, we'd had it in an argument where one of us would say, and the other one
I'm done,
ready to hear it or able to, whereas this was a much calmer resignation of what we were going to do.
And so that must have felt so sad for both of you.
It did.
Was it relief or what?
No, actually, I thought it would be, but it wasn't. And I think I felt that more than Steve did, because I don't know whether this is to do with I was the person looking in. He was the person that it was happening to, but I was the person looking in, and I should have been able to do something about it. And I'd been strong, and now it was up to me to walk away. And
you're giving up.
I think sometimes that's harder, isn't it? Actually, sometimes it's easier for someone to leave you than it is to be the one that gets up and goes.
Yes. I mean, I think both have their versions that are really, really difficult. But for you, you thought you'd feel kind of, okay, I'm relieved now. I knew I've done my best. But actually you felt what? Distressed, upset, frightened?
I felt scared. Yeah. I felt scared because I thought this is going to be a big change. I'm not great with change. And some friends have been through, there are various friends who've been through various versions of divorce. And I thought, we have to be really, really sure. And I know that sounds ridiculous, having said that we spent 20 years in sort of almost heading to this point. But I did think, you know, are we really sure? Have we really done everything? And there was something that sort of, when Steve said, let's do this, let's break up, let's tell everyone, let's set the wheels in motion. He said, I can't put you through this anymore. I can't. It's unfair of me to put you through this. I think because of that reaction, I thought, okay, well, we don't have to rush it. This is what we're going to do, and we'll do this in the right way, but we don't have to rush through it.
And so what did that mean? So you didn't ring a divorce lawyer straight away? I mean, I remember I had a divorce lawyer said, you know, there is no good divorce. It's like all divorces are really horrendous. I mean, I'm sure somebody can argue that, but that it's an incredibly painful, difficult process for everybody involved. And your children, of course.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of the sort of thinking, well, I've always thought that because Steve and I are such good friends and we started as friends, that I thought we'd be okay. And it sounds so naive to say it, but I thought, oh, well, we will always be friends. So we'll be able to do this. We'll be able to find our way through this. And of course, there's that's ridiculous.
It was sort of naive in a way.
Yeah.
It was a kind of...
Yeah. But what happened actually was that in the process of both of us beginning to live as a sort of separated couple without...
So separate bedrooms, no more sex.
Not separate bedrooms, but in that we are going to co-parent and we're going to think about how we begin to extricate and how we tell people. So it's in that dark part where we were discussing how to break up and saying, okay, we're still in the house together. We haven't talked to the children. We haven't voiced this. We need to work this out. I spoke to a friend of mine and she said, I sort of talked to her about we're breaking up and this is what's happening. This is how I'm feeling. And she said, do you know, I've thought for a while that Steve might have ADHD. And in the way that you talk about what you're going through, she said her and her husband were having a similar conversation. And so she recommended a book to me about ADHD in marriage.
Mm.
And that really was the catalyst for what happened next. So I've written a book about the year that started with us agreeing to divorce and then became this quest for understanding of something that was, for Steve, was buried beneath all of his sort of childhood trauma and where the triggers for his depression and had hidden this neurodivergence.
Gosh.
And that had a massive impact on how we continued our marriage, in the sense that we were still talking about breaking up. We were still looking at how that would work financially, practically, how we would do it. But alongside that was this sudden revelation that there might be something else that we'd never considered. And I've written a book about our experience and about our year. It's called The Honesty Box, and it depicts trying to get to the truth of the matter, and also that in that year, one of Steve's great sanctuaries is to go into the garden, and we garden together a bit. But I mean, we're not particularly a great garden couple.
Buddies. Yeah.
We do things in quite different ways. I'm very slapdash, but I'd always wanted to set up an honesty box outside our garden gate. And so I wanted to have a project, and I thought it would get him into the garden and it would get us doing something together in some way, us talking about something that wasn't his depression,
Divorce.
that wasn't divorce, that wasn't this awful panic about the children and money, and it was just...
So for people that don't know, honesty boxes are where you leave vegetables or eggs or honey outside your house, and you leave a box and people put the money in and take the goods, right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And I've always loved them. I've always thought
yes,
that they
I love
were
them.
a sort of beacon of generosity and one of our gorgeous national treasures, except that they're not just a sort of British idiosyncrasy. They're global. You know, they're amazing examples globally. I've come across so many brilliant stories and talked to so many people who have set them up. You know, lots of people now will send me photographs when they're on holiday of honesty boxes that they've come across.
You light up talking about them. They really inspire you.
I love them. I love them. They're just such a happy thing. It's sort of like really great foraging when you turn a corner and you find one. And so I've loved them. I'd never thought about doing my own. And so Steve was the one that said, we should do this. This would be fun. We should do this. And we do grow veg, and we don't really grow enough, or we haven't grown enough to really be able to share it. So this was a way to tackle that and see if we could grow more and give us a distraction. So the book charts that. It shows the sort of year of growing and we love eating. So there's a lot of food references as well. But alongside it's the realization and then the diagnosis of neurodivergence and where that took us.
So for people listening who might have similar difficulties with you, I mean, everyone is unique, and yet, why these conversations are important, that the people recognize that the most personal is often the most universal, that people recognize themselves. So in shorthand, it's when you got to rock bottom and you weren't fighting to save the marriage, but discussing how you separate and how you do that practically, financially. But the thing that really transformed it, well, it feels like there were two things that transformed it. One was that despite 20 years of dealing with healthcare professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, no one had ever suggested that Steve do an ADHD test, a psychological test. No one had thought that might be part of his depression problem.
No.
So he'd had trauma and lots of things that you could see could be the presenting problem, but actually beneath the presenting problem was how he's wired, how his brain operates.
Yes.
And so he was fighting something with the wrong tools all the way through.
Yeah.
And so I'll come to the honesty box, but so from his perspective and your perspective, once he'd been given the diagnosis, was he then given tools that could change how he felt about himself, how he was in relation to you? What happened?
Well, first of all, I mean, as you know, it's really hard to get a diagnosis now. The waiting lists are horrendously long, and
months and months and months.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, and
it's a kind of tragedy, actually, isn't it?
It is. It's a real epidemic, and particularly for those of us, middle age. And I suppose and I think he had various comments when he was talking about it to GPs, and I think part of it, I think someone said, well, if you've been dealing with it this long, then almost like, why not just continue? It was a sort of slightly dismissed, and also that, oh, well, this is just another thing that he wants to investigate. And
it's like he's a hypochondriac, but for his mental health.
Yeah.
Dismissing him, diminishing.
Yeah. In fact, the catalyst before this friend saying, why don't you think about ADHD, was that he had EMDR treatment. So he'd been diagnosed with PTSD. He'd had EMDR treatment, and it was really good. It really helped him, and he will talk about that. He's evangelical about that.
I think EMDR is transformative.
Yeah, it made such a huge difference, and it was amazing. And I thought, naively, that this was the answer, and so did he. But there were things it just didn't touch, and we just couldn't understand.
It only touches trauma. It doesn't touch.
Yes, and it did touch trauma, and it really helped. But I think because of that, he sort of describes it as an archaeological dig, and everything was dusted away. There was nothing left, and yet still he had these feelings and these difficulties and these mood dysregulation. And
just tell me the symptoms that were most common.
Mood dysregulation was a big thing. So his mood swings were, he could be absolutely hyper and then incredibly low. And you didn't always know what you were going to get. And if we were in a social situation...
Which is a bit like bipolar.
Yes. And actually we did think that was one of the things that before he had EMDR treatment, that was one of the things that they looked into. But there was sometimes this huge disconnect with what was going on around him, with his understanding of social situations, of nuance, incredibly distracted, has got no concept of time. It struggles with rejection, struggles with criticism. And so there was sort of all of these these things that had lined up. And so when we read about ADHD, it ticked some of those boxes. It didn't tick all of them, but it ticked some of them.
But also the criticism and some of those other symptoms evolve from having a mental health disorder that is never met.
Yeah.
And attuned to, because you then have less confidence in yourself. So there's a self-perpetuating difficulty that just gets increasingly worse because you don't trust yourself, you fear judgment. So it's a sort of negative cycle, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely. I mean, that's how it yes, it's sort of how it manifests. And he spent many, many years like that, you know, living
painful.
like that his entire adult life, of sort of self-loathing. And so the diagnosis, for the ADHD diagnosis, we borrowed some money and he went privately to have that, because it was a over 2-year waiting list. He saw one GP who thought that he should have a course of CBT, which, considering how much treatment he'd had over the years, yes, just felt
so
like
dismissive.
Back to the beginning of something. So he went privately for the ADHD diagnosis, and that was incredible, actually. I've heard some people have not been as lucky with the psychiatrist that they may have chosen or has been recommended to them, but Steve found, just I think by chance, and also because he just liked his photograph on the website and thought that he looked like a nice man, he chose someone who was amazing. And he got the diagnosis, and it was this 98%, but most likely
outcome.
Yes, and the psychiatrist said, I can prescribe you medication. And so in answer to your, you know, the sort of the coping mechanisms and that was the first step.
And that really changed. That had more impact than all the other depression drugs that she'd used, psychotropic.
Yeah, it did. I mean, there were side effects. And I think he is particularly sensitive to those. So I know we found that some people can dip in and dip out. The psychiatrist said you can take the weekends off. You don't need to take this all the time. You don't. But for Steve, it was difficult for him to have a 24-hour break, because it sent him plummeting in a way that was almost worse than before.
Frightening. Yeah.
And so he would completely shut down. And because of the difficulty sometimes in getting hold of the medication, because of the number of people that are now being diagnosed and the unavailability of it, there would be periods of time where we couldn't get hold of it. And so we would be gearing up for a week without medication. And so that was the first part of it.
And that feels so, just, I mean, I didn't say anything there, just because it just feels like your whole world falls apart because you can't get a medication, but also that your world has been falling apart because you couldn't get a diagnosis, or no one suggested that you need a diagnosis. Just feels such a tragedy and such a relief that he's got it. And it's not for free. I mean, obviously there are side effects that are difficult, but it sounds like he found himself, like it helped with the mood swings. Did it help with the attention? It helped with confidence in himself. How did it change him?
It changed him in the way that he was much more focused. So in terms of his work, and as a lot of us do, work defines us, and it really defines him. And so he felt much better able to focus. He felt that he had a clarity, that the brain fog had sort of lifted, and he felt this energy, almost too much energy, almost sort of the springing out of bed, not being able to get back into bed, sleeping, strange sleep patterns, which, you know, weren't ideal. But there were so many positives about it, and he felt this utter relief at having something. But then that feeling of relying on it so completely that when you think it might be taken away, it's terrifying. And we've had various points where he has been ringing the GP, the pharmacy, trying to track.
I've had clients doing that. It's just awful.
It's terrible. Him jumping in the car, them ringing and saying, because if someone turns up, they can't, the drugs aren't specified to a person. They're just there. And whoever turns up first
Gets
come,
them.
first served. And we were finding that people were driving across the county to get
to the pharmacy.
To find them. Yeah. And so that's quite frightening because you're sort of given an answer.
Yeah.
And then you can't rely on that. And there always seemed to be a big family event coming up just as he'd run out. And of course, the other thing about...
Does he have a regular supply now? Is that something that's eased?
It has eased.
Just because the drug companies are supplying more. So this was...
Yeah, it has eased. Every so often there's a little wobble and there's a sort of mention of, or he'll ring and they'll say, well, we haven't got it in now. But actually the relationship that he's got with our local chemist is lovely. Great. You know, they are incredibly supportive and the GP's been great, but actually the chemist is so good at it because the panic, the panic that ensues and the desperation.
Yeah.
And the chemist has been so good at
regulating him.
Yeah.
I've got it. We'll get it in a couple of days.
Yeah.
You'll be all right.
I'll ring you before 1 o'clock. I'll take, the giving him a structure within that has been so reassuring.
So you're married to a different man?
Well,
no.
No, I'm not. No, because the other part of it...
There are never any happy ever afters, are there?
There are never any happy ever afters. And actually, what transpired was when he went, because he had a shared care agreement with the NHS, so he then was evaluated by an NHS psychiatrist. The NHS psychiatrist said, this is more complex than ADHD. And so through a very unbelievably difficult meeting, and then a more form-filling, more conversation, the psychiatrist diagnosed him with ASD as well as ADHD. So he has this dual diagnosis, which
is AS stand for?
It's autism.
Oh, right.
So the two often go hand in hand as often, but it's only been in the last 10 years that they've been allowed to diagnose the two together. 10 years ago, you had to choose whether you were one or the other. But in fact, they're quite different things. Although they cross over, they're quite different things. And actually, what we realized was that the medication was helping on one level really, really well. But again, it wasn't dealing with certain aspects of Steve's struggle. And that in the diagnosis, and it was clear that the autism, but no, there is no magic pill for that. And there is nothing that you can change. That was the other part of it. That was the final missing part.
Has the knowledge been a relief? I mean, sometimes getting diagnosis puts you in a box and you feel trapped, but for other people it feels like it's an enlightenment, like at last I know what's going on with me. I understand why I'm like I am. It's not me failing.
Yes.
And I mean, we're talking about Steve and he's not on the call. So tell me about you through this process and what enabled you to kind of stay curious, stay connected, not stop the proceedings of the divorce. Tell me your process.
I think that I was really curious about this diagnosis and where it was taking us and how Steve was responding to it. And as I said before, he's so open to understanding and wanting answers, wanting to understand, to accept, to grow from the information that he's been given, that I respond to that. And I find that reassuring. I think if he'd said, oh, well, I'm not going to do anything about it, but this is me, I'm not going to do anything about it.
Furious, yeah.
Yes, we wouldn't still be together. But as the process has gone on, we've been able to talk more openly than I think we have in 20 years, even though that sounds ridiculous because we've had big conversations.
Did you ever have couples therapy? You must have done.
No.
That's interesting.
I mean, in all honesty, we couldn't afford it
No.
because he was in therapy. And so that felt more important.
Than the
So we
couple.
couldn't do it as a couple as well, even though there were points where I thought it would be really, really useful. And the only time that we've been together with a medical professional is the psychiatrist when he gave the diagnosis of ASD. And that's the only time that I've been in that environment with Steve. And I found that quite incredible because I felt that I was sitting with someone who I had never met but could trust completely, and who understood and who saw me as much as they saw Steve.
Because it's a couple issue, right? It's not just,
Yeah.
you know, any illness is if you're in a partnership, is a family issue. It's not just
Yeah.
one person.
And actually, I don't think we really addressed it like that before. And I think with these diagnoses, it really did throw this completely different light onto it happening to us too. You know,
Yeah.
well,
And your children. Like
yeah.
they have a dad
Yes.
with this. Help them understand him and
Yeah.
the family dynamics and
yeah.
the things
It
that
really
have gone
did.
crashingly wrong in the past, so that there was more compassion, less judgment. I don't know. Tell me.
Yeah, it made sense. I think
Yeah.
that was what happened. It made sense. And I think we talk about it very openly. And there are times when I think, are we too open about it? And there are times when Steve will talk about something and I will just say, right, you can stop. They don't need that bit. I mean, they're teens plus, but still, you are their father. They don't need all the detail. He is the sort of father that if they want to know what happens to something, and if it's, you know, a dead animal or he will go into all the detail. He won't hold back because they're children. He will explain everything. And so I wanted that, but also I would still wanted to protect them. I still didn't want them to have
Too
know
much
everything.
information.
Yeah. But they're incredibly proud of how he has dealt with the diagnosis and how open he is. And also there's those moments where it's difficult for them. They tell him. And I don't think
so now they have a language
Yeah.
and a hook, so they can go, this isn't dad being a nightmare. This is dad's ADHD or his autistic traits.
And they will say to him in a situation where he might be cross about something or be sort of off on a tangent, they will say, stop. They will say that word and they will say, this isn't about you, this is about me, or this isn't about me, this is about you. And they can delineate, which is amazing because it's taken me 20 years to do that. And they see it really clearly. And that
I think the big takeaway is there's a lot in what you said, but is that it's a collective issue that needs to be addressed collectively.
Yeah.
That it's not just his problem. I mean, it's a societal problem.
Yeah.
It's a broader collective, and there's massive issues with mental health and the budgets and everything that you also said. But within your family, if he had remained the problem, then he would have been isolated and excluded. Whereas it sounds like you find ways of communicating that included and allowed and gave all of you a sense of kind of collective agency, given that this was a difficult thing.
Yeah, it sounds perfect when you say it.
It's messy in the doing. But so the thing that the external honesty box, so your curiosity and innate love for him, I guess, and not wanting to separate, kept you open enough through all the travails of the diagnosis and the medication and trying it out and all of that. But coming together on a project that isn't a child project, which I guess is the only other way you've worked together.
Yeah.
Did that ignite love for each other more? What did it do?
I think it just showed very clearly who we are and how we deal with things and how we accept that the other one is going to deal with this differently, and that we joke about that now, so that there will be situations where he will do something in a different way, or he will think about it in a different way, or it will take him 3 hours And I have a very different
Fast.
approach to that, and I'm much quicker and much more sort of controlled, and also don't always come up with something that's great. I rush through things, and I think that the process of doing this and being in the garden together and trying to garden in the same space, which, considering we are quite different, is
It's a kind of intimacy.
Yes, yeah. And also that there'd be times where I would go out there and I would struggle to be out there without him, and I would miss him, and that would surprise me because often I would need a break. But often I would think, I need a break from this marriage. I need a break from this person. And so
I don't think there's a marriage in the world that people don't have that feeling. I think that's a universal norm.
But I think I'm probably not the best person for, if we're going to match people in a sort of, I probably am not the best match for him, because I'm a terrible people pleaser. And so his honesty in conversation, in social situations, would absolutely, I found it
the shame it brought in you
excruciating. And I found shame is a good word, because I didn't think this at the time, but I do now. Ashamed. I was ashamed of our relationship. I was ashamed of his depression. I was angry. I was, why can't we just
be normal?
Normal. And that awful word, normal, is shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet, this man has encouraged me to write a book about a very personal experience, and he has been the one that has pushed me to be more open and more honest. And the bravery,
it's a lot of courage.
It's a huge amount of courage for him to sit down and read what I've written and say, I want you to tell this story.
Yeah. What did you fall in love with him when you first started going out?
Well, all the traits, his impulsiveness, his joy, his exuberance, his intelligence, his ability to focus on a subject and find out everything about it, and then move on to the next thing, the next hobby, and then the next hobby.
So what you fell in love with him for were also the traits that you ended up hating him for?
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of the other things that kept us together was that he saw me, and he didn't want to change me.
So and he gave you the kind of love you didn't give him, actually.
I think that's what was so shaming, was that he didn't even think about trying to change me. But I did think about trying to change him.
It drove you nuts that you couldn't change him.
Yeah.
So the book and talking to me now is taking a lot of courage from you too, because it's not like you come out like the shining angel. You come out like all of us, kind of flawed human being who is doing the best you can given who you are and the circumstances you're in. And sometimes doing the best you can doesn't feel great.
No, it doesn't. And I think being able to be honest, admittedly, in quite a public way by writing a book about it, I think I'm not sure I could have done it any other way, actually, because as a writer, that
you hold the narrative.
Yeah. So that was the only way I could really, and that's how it started, by me just keeping a diary of what we were dealing with, just because it helped me.
So for people listening, of course they can buy your book, which I hope they do. But people who have a similar situation, what do you want them to take away?
I think it's really hard, because I think when you're in a relationship, like the one I'm in, there are times where you think you are being honest. There are times when you think that you can have these honest conversations, but actually in hindsight, we didn't have the right type of honest conversation. And
what does the right type look like?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I think we were so focused on solving Steve and dealing with that that we didn't look at our marriage and at how I was behaving within that and how I
your
might not
part in
be
it.
helpful. Yes. So I think we were being honest about one part, but we weren't standing back and looking at the whole. And we should have had help with that. And that would be my advice. To have some help with that would be really useful. Because I don't think that we were equipped to do it ourselves.
No, because you can't see yourselves when you're in it.
No.
You need a third eye, don't you?
Yeah. And I mean, that's about marriages in difficulty in general. Being more specific about a partner being diagnosed with neurodivergence, I would say there are lots of coping mechanisms that we're still trying to put them into practice. We're still trying to work them out, but certainly we do things differently. And I think if you're both okay with that, then I think that's another big reason why we're still together. Because, for example, socially, Steve really struggles in certain social situations. We used to have lots of friends. We're quite insular now, and that's both our choices. But also, I will go off and do things on my own a lot, and I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm happy
Less
not
emotionally exhausting than worrying about how
Yeah.
he's going to respond or be, or how people respond to him.
Yes. So those coping mechanisms are there. And I think that when he was first diagnosed, I was sort of reading all of those things. I was very aware of all of these triggers. I was very aware of, right, okay, this is what we need to do in this situation. There's things like time blindness and things like, there's things about not being told that you're wrong, or that dealing with criticism and dealing with rejection. And then something would happen and Steve would be furious with himself about it, as if he had forgotten that
He had the diagnosis.
Yes. And so that took up a lot of time.
So it's like learning a whole new language, isn't it? About yourself. I mean, how to speak your own self language.
Yeah.
But for both of you, and also your kids, but also the children in some ways seem to have learned quicker, because we get stuck in our particular patterns, don't we?
Yes.
The older we are. They have more flexibility, more openness.
They're so good at it.
Which is great.
Yeah. It's really good.
So we're coming to the end. Obviously, you want everyone to know you've written your book, which is The Honesty Box. And tell me when it's coming out.
At the end of February the 27th.
And will you do interviews together?
We haven't been asked to. I think we would. I mean, that would be interesting for me to relinquish that.
I'm so interested that, I mean, if I fully realized, I did realize what our interview is going to be about, but as we've been in the conversation, I thought the person that's missing here is Steve.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had a really, I think, great conversation, but
I think the thing about the book is that it is my
version.
story. It is my version, because actually I'm really interested in those people like me who are in the shadow of something, and those people who are really trying to support in whatever way they can. And so my book, although there's a lot about Steve and how he copes with it and how we cope with it as a family, it's my voice.
So overall, the way that you've coped is by keeping going?
Yeah. And making things funny.
Yeah.
Humor, sort of
dark humor.
Using dark humor has really, really helped. And also that we don't sort of think too far ahead, so that we don't
overwhelm yourselves.
Yes, yeah. And I think that really works for Steve. And we try not to book things in too far ahead, or we try not to have too much structure, that it is dealing with each thing as it comes up.
Keeping it in the day.
Yes.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for coming on to Therapy Works podcast. I wish you the best with your book. And thank you for a really interesting conversation.
Oh, Julia, thank you so much. I've loved talking to you. I could talk to you for hours. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure. Emily and Sophie, very nice to see you. And we're going to talk about Lucy Brazier and the ups and downs of her marriage. Do you want to kind of tell me your first thoughts?
Well, I have to say, and I don't know whether I was just not listening properly, but until about 3/4 of the way through, I thought they actually had got divorced. But they hadn't got divorced because there was like this whole section about telling the children about the divorce and telling everybody. And I don't know whether that was just me, that I only sort of worked out like, oh, they stayed together. So I suppose for me, it was like what I thought the narrative was going to be was not the narrative that it was, which was really interesting and unexpected.
But also, I think it's interesting how close you can get to divorce and pull back. I mean, I think that's probably more common than we think, or I don't know.
Well, I think definitely what is, I think can be true is that you reach a kind of breaking point and it kind of something has to change. And it can either sort of push you into doing something different, or that something different could be like, okay, we're not going to stay together. But in their case, there's something different, was like going down this journey of diagnosis and understanding his brain and his identity, and that helps them come together along with the honesty box.
It sort of makes you think how long. I think this is true in marriage, but probably I think it's true for people in so many parts of life. We try to keep alive the structures that aren't really working for us for so long before we're really ready or able to say, I give up, this isn't working. And actually, therefore, that sort of destructive cycle, where actually when you break something, there's opportunity for something new to come through. You know, like Esther Perel's thing of you can have multiple marriages or you can have multiple marriages within one marriage, create something new again. It was also, I felt sort of grateful to someone sharing stories about marriage being difficult, because I think marriage and relationships are private, and understandably so. It makes sense for people to be protective about what's really going on between their partners. But at the same time, I also think it makes many people feel quite isolated. And if they're finding their marriage or their relationship difficult, a kind of, is it only me? Is this normal? Or what's okay to put up with and what's actually not okay and should be looking for help, you know, when people have those questions. And so I think it's just really useful when someone breaks that taboo and just has a really honest, open exploration of how it can be.
And useful for people who are not married too, I think, because I've worked with quite a lot of single parents, which is obviously incredibly tough. But I think often the perception is, oh, well, like if you have a partner, everything is sort of sunshine and roses. And of course, there are such different challenges if you're a single parent, but it doesn't mean that there's not also real difficulty but being with somebody else. And I agree, Sophie. It also made me really think about the importance of stories, the narratives that we tell, and how often the narrative is really about the person that the thing is happening to. So in this case, Steve, and not so much about the person who is the partner of that person or the loved one of that person and what that like for them. And I think it was so valuable to sort of get the flip side of it. And what was interesting is that even in the episode, it was really hard not to get sucked in to his story and what happened to him, and to kind of stick with actually what was her experience of that. And I thought that was really insightful, Mum, when you're like, oh, like I sort of, you know, feels like Steve is missing here because so much of this is about him. But it also highlighted how hard it is to actually stick with the experience of the other person.
I think I said it, that when someone is ill, whether it's cancer or mental illness or struggling with a business, or it is a systemic problem. And often, even in the relationship, it becomes focused on the person that's ill, and the impact on the other family members is in some way diminished. And I think if we can really recognize everyone is affected for very many good reasons. And I think what was interesting about Steve is he knew he was kind of inflicting pain. And one of the reasons for the divorce for him was that he didn't want to go on doing that. But maybe if we acknowledge the collective difficulty, he isn't the bad guy and nor is
No.
she, and then that changes the whole dynamic.
Yeah.
I think it's so difficult, isn't it? That partner role where if you're in some sense caring for the other person in whatever capacity, it feels also then very hard to make demands, to take up space, to say it's not working for you, because she described it this, it's not his fault and he's trying. So how can I say either I don't want to do this anymore ultimately, or even up to this point, like, I don't really want to look after you today. You know, I've got needs. When you think you're the sort of well person, as it were, quote unquote, and actually, not only does that narrative getting around the unwell person in whatever form take up, doesn't mean there's a lack of recognition, but it's also not helpful for the unwell person either.
It's very disabling.
It's not disabling, and it makes you feel like a burden. But also, I do think people in pain can become extremely self-absorbed, and actually, that's not a very happy place to be. You get very caught in your own, like, I'm in pain, and how do I make this feel better? I don't want to be in pain. And actually, if another person actually goes, oi, excuse me, wake up, I'm struggling too, it can bring you out of yourself, and they get to care for you in some respects. That really evens out that dynamic a little bit between sort of carer and
I think it
unwell
stops the
person.
sort of hierarchy of what is valid and what isn't valid. If you have a mental diagnosis, that's valid. If you're the partner of someone with a mental diagnosis, you're fine. I think is very simplistic and not the reality. The other thing I find, like, just the absolute fury I felt that it took so long to get ADHD and then to get the autism spectrum diagnosis too. And
Oh, by the way, ma'am, PDA, pathological demand avoidance. That's what that is.
ooh, I've never even heard of that. What's that?
Well, it's not a diagnosis. It's like under the sort of umbrella of autism, a particular expression of autism, I suppose, is maybe the way to describe it, is pathological demand avoidance. And the sort of its presentation is essentially, if you are asked to do something, it's very difficult for you to be able to kind of go ahead and do that thing. And so there's all sorts of ways to kind of get around that. And it comes from an anxiety, like the underneath PDA is anxiety. And so you sort of get around it by, firstly, you want to be sort of very low arousal, but also kind of you give indirect demands essentially. So instead of saying you need to get dressed, you say, I have put your clothes on the bed.
That works for children.
Yeah, well, like often children with autism present with PDA, but it's difficult. It's very difficult because obviously everything in you is saying, like, I just want to say, get in the car. Like, is that such a terrible thing to say? So I think it's a difficult diagnosis, but there's lots of online resources. If you're like, oh, that sounds like my child or my partner. Yeah.
On the sort of practical, I was also sad when she was saying, I know I had a real, sadness moment when she was like, oh, we couldn't afford therapy and couples therapy. That just wasn't an option for us. And it's just so shit. It's just a shit systemic situation. And also I wanted to mention for people that Relate do have a sliding scale where you can access couples therapy according to what you can afford. You can sort of go onto the Relate website and put your postcode in, and it will tell you where your nearest Relate center is. So for people who are in that dynamic, it is worth exploring that. You do always have to pay something, but it is a sliding scale.
That's really good.
The adult diagnosis thing is really interesting because I agree that it's sort of outrageous that he wasn't diagnosed before, having seen however many psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists. I think there's also been an explosion of adult diagnosis, particularly of ADHD. And that's really interesting. On the one hand, like for Steve, it's incredibly helpful to sort of understand yourself and understand like, oh, well, it makes sense that I'm always late because I have ADHD, and therefore like time is like now or some other like vacuum thing, and therefore impossible to sort of contextualize. I think there is a sort of part of me that is like, are we just sort of pathologizing being human? I mean, I'm not talking about for Steve, I'm sort of just talking about in general in society, like where does it just become like, this is just the way that I work and it's not a diagnosis, it's just that I'm a human with all sorts of things, that I have strengths and frailties and things that I'm varied at. And I suppose it's the same whenever you get a diagnosis. It could be really helpful. And sometimes you're sort of like, what am I wanting this for? Or what's the sort of driver here?
I sort of had a related reflection, which is, as we're saying, there could be lots of very useful things about diagnosis.
And for him,
in
it was
helping
medication
understand.
that was transformative.
And in particular, that it points towards treatment and how to adapt to his needs. And I also had the thought of, do we always need a diagnosis to accept ourselves, or for other people to come to a sense of acceptance of who we are? Not always, but like to some extent, I think sometimes we won't just be like, we fight it, right? We either fight the other person, like, I wish you were more on time, or we fight ourselves, like, I wish I was better at being more organized. Whereas, it's a sort of simplistic example, but if there was some acceptance of a lot of those adaptations that people describe, are also possible if we were like, this is what we find hard. What are our different ways of doing this? For example, they describe becoming a lot less social, because that was very overwhelming for him. And it's sometimes the wanting to fit a way of living or being or who you are, that you are not, or you are not as a couple, or you are not as a family, that. And if that was let go of, it's sort of that Rogers quote, the paradox is that if I accept myself as I am, then I can change.
That's what I was thinking. Like that's also DBT therapies, like acceptance and change. You kind of have to have both. In order to change, you have to accept the current situation, yourself, your marriage.
And I sometimes wonder if your diagnosis is one of the things like, oh, now I can accept these are my characteristics and adapt around them and change around them. When actually we could also do that for things that are not reaching diagnostic levels of, that are just things we find hard.
Well, exactly. There was a bit, Mum, where you sort of said, people say there's no such thing as a good divorce. And obviously that's quite a
I remembered what she'd said to me now.
controversial things to say. And not that you were saying it, you're saying people say. And I think I would disagree. I think there's no such thing as an easy divorce. Like, divorce is messy and there are so many difficult things that you have to manage and sort out that press on most of our primal buttons to do with children and love and money and having enough and fairness. And I think it is an incredibly difficult process, and there will almost definitely be pain and loss and probably conflict at some point. But I think in the longer term, there can definitely be good divorces that ultimately benefit everybody in the family. I just think it's not usually like a easy process to get there.
I think that's a really good way of qualifying what I said. I actually, it is what I meant, that the actual process is difficult, but I wasn't saying...
Don't get divorced.
Or don't get divorced, or that there is not a good divorce after you've gone through the splitting up and the dividing and the money and all of that.
Yeah.
And there are definitely people who do really well after divorce. And also families and couples that can come together and co-parent and see each other at Christmas and birthdays and have a good relationship. Better relationship. I've had people say I've got a better relationship with my partner now we've divorced than I did when we were married. So, I mean, you're good to kind of take me up on that and make that point.
I was listening to this podcast actually the other day that was talking about this thing called the Collaborative Divorce Coalition or something in New York. And they have a system where it's essentially trying to make divorce as low conflict as possible. And the way they try to do this is essentially incentivize divorce lawyers to come to an agreement as quickly and easily as possible. And how they do it is essentially they talk through all the assets and the different things that they have to decide. And then if one of the sides, one of the lawyers takes issue with the other side, they can do that. They can say, I don't think that's fair. I don't think you should have to give up this or whatever the thing is. But then they have to give up the case. They have to give that case to a different lawyer. So they're incentivized personally to get an agreement. And I was like, that is genius.
That is genius.
I don't know
Because
if we
it's-
have a version of that in the UK. I know you have mediation, but I don't know.
Because it definitely is an incentive for lawyers to make it as protracted and difficult as
Yeah,
possible because of the
exactly.
fees.
Anyway.
That is really
It
interesting.
reminds
Wow.
me of, I don't think it's actually running now anymore, but there was something set up in the UK called FDAC, the Family Drugs and Alcohol Court, which were for court proceedings when children were being removed from parents to be put into care. And this particular judge said, you know, he was in this court case, a normal court, and a mother shouted at him, this was his 6th child he was taking off her, "I'm going to have a baby every single year until you let me keep one." And he was like, this is not working. This system is not working. And instead, he set up this pilot, FDAC, which was basically a collaboration between the core and a FDAC support worker, was like, to the point with the aim that the parent would either decide that they could get the support they need to support their child and the core could agree, or that the parent themselves would say, "You're right, I'm not ready." Like an
More
agreement
reflective
and a reflective, and over many months. So they'd have a certain number of months to try and get to a certain place, and they get support to do that. And they would come back in between and assess how it was going. Because that oppositional stance, isn't it, by definition, makes it very hard for people to accept the outcome.
That's really interesting. So I'm really appreciative of Lucy and Steve, and I think it is a really insightful, interesting conversation that we don't hear in other places. So I really value that. And I've actually learned a lot from you two today. So thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.